Sometimes the greatest danger comes from the person you think you know, a face you recognize, a voice you trust, someone who's been inside your home, someone you've hired, someone you've helped. It's September 8th, 2010, and for one Kansas woman, an ordinary morning is about to become a nightmare that will change her life forever. Marty Hill had no reason to be afraid that morning. At just 97 pounds, she was a powerhouse at work, known for her reliability and dedication. Her co-workers called her dynamite in a small package. She was the type of person who always showed up, always got things done, always made everything around her better. Which is exactly why, when she didn't show up for the 10 o'clock production meeting at her apparel company, everyone knew something was terribly wrong. The tight-knit group at her workplace had never seen Marty miss a meeting without explanation. She was dependable to a fault. When text messages went unanswered and phone calls went straight to voicemail, concern quickly turned to fear. By 11:30 that morning, a co-worker made the decision to drive to Marty's house. What they found there would launch an investigation that would reveal just how dangerous it can be to trust the wrong person. Marty's car sat in the driveway. Her front door was closed but unlocked. Her purse sat undisturbed on the kitchen table. But Marty was nowhere to be found upstairs. It wasn't until police arrived and ventured into the basement that they discovered the horrifying truth. At the bottom of those basement stairs lay a woman covered head to toe in blood, breathing but barely alive. The amount of blood surrounding her on the floor told a story of unimaginable violence. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This wasn't a random break-in. This was something far more personal and infinitely more terrifying. The officer who found her knelt beside the barely conscious woman and asked the question that would drive the entire investigation. Who did this to you? Who did this in those critical moments? As Marty fought for her life, the race was on to find her attacker before they could strike again. When paramedics rushed Marty to the hospital, doctors were stunned by the extent of her injuries. The major veins, skin, and muscle of her left neck had been completely severed. The major artery had multiple scrapes on it, missing complete severance by mere millimeters. Her face was swollen beyond recognition, covered in bruises that spoke to a sustained and vicious beating. The head trauma alone was life-threatening. For the next hour and a half, surgeons worked meticulously to piece together the damage, cleaning and repairing injuries that should have killed her. Even then, doctors remained gravely concerned about brain swelling and the possibility that Marty might not survive the next 24 to 72 hours. Her family arrived at the hospital to find a woman they barely recognized. Marty's eyes were swollen completely shut. Her head was 3 times its normal size. Her teenage daughter later described seeing only her mother's hands and knowing those were the only parts she could still identify. The emotional trauma of seeing their loved one in this condition was almost unbearable. But even as Marty fought for her life in the ICU, investigators were working around the clock to find her attacker. With no signs of sexual assault and no theft from the home, the motive remained a complete mystery. Marty's mother provided crucial information about her daughter's quiet lifestyle. She was a workaholic who rarely left the house except for work. She wasn't dating anyone and kept to herself. The investigation initially focused on Marty's ex-husband, Steve Hill. In cases like this, law enforcement always looks first at those closest to the victim. But Steve was cooperative, providing a detailed account of his activities that day and expressing genuine concern for Marty's well-being. He wanted to find her attacker just as desperately as everyone else did. With Steve cleared as a suspect, investigators found themselves with very limited leads. That's when Marty's mother mentioned B&J Construction, a company that had recently done work on both her home and Marty's. The supervisor, a man named Brian, had seemed like a nice guy, a hard worker, and a family man. Marty's mother had even recommended him based on the quality work he'd done at her house. Brian Pennington was 26 years old and lived in Leeton, Missouri, about an hour and a half from Kansas City. When detectives arrived at his secluded dark house around 9 p.m., they found him polite and cooperative. But something wasn't right. Brian had several fresh scratches on the left side of his face that he claimed came from his dog jumping on him the day before. To the trained eyes of experienced investigators, those scratches didn't look consistent with what a dog would do. Brian kept emphasizing his financial difficulties, claiming there was no way he could have driven to Kansas City because he didn't have money for gas. His young wife, Jessica, backed up his alibi, insisting he'd been home with her the entire time. But when detectives asked to search Brian's clothing for any bloodstains, he readily agreed. What they found in a hamper in the corner of the bathroom would change everything. A pair of jeans near the bottom was covered in red stains, concentrated around the knees and lower portions of the legs. Brian claimed the stains weren't blood, but when detectives rushed the jeans to the crime lab that same night, they tested positive for human blood within 30 minutes. The question now was whose blood it was, and investigators would have to wait several more days for DNA results. The cooperation Brian showed in allowing the search of his home surprised investigators. Most guilty parties don't willingly hand over evidence that could convict them. But perhaps Brian thought the investigation wouldn't go any further, that his word and his wife's alibi would be enough to clear him. Meanwhile, Marty remained in critical condition, unable to communicate with investigators. Doctors were cautiously optimistic, but her recovery was far from certain. The attack had been so brutal, so sustained, that it seemed impossible anyone could survive it. Yet somehow, Marty was fighting back. On the third day after the attack, everything changed. Marty suddenly began to speak, and with her words came the flood of memories from that terrible morning. There was no confusion, no uncertainty in her voice. She knew exactly who had attacked her and why she had opened her door to him that early morning. The man she named would shock everyone who knew him as a trusted contractor, a family man, someone who had been welcomed into homes throughout the community. But appearances, as this case would prove, can be fatally deceiving. As the DNA results came back, confirming that the blood on Brian Pennington's jeans belonged to Marty Hill, investigators realized they were dealing with someone far more dangerous than they had initially imagined. This wasn't a crime of passion or a robbery gone wrong. This was something much darker, and the question that haunted everyone involved was simple: why? Brian Pennington had been in Marty's home before. He'd done work there, earned her trust, been paid for his services. When he knocked on her door that September morning, she had no reason to fear him. She recognized his face, knew his voice, remembered the quality of his work. It was this familiarity that made him so dangerous. According to Marty's recollection, Brian mentioned something about the basement, something he thought she should know about from his previous work there. It seemed reasonable enough. Contractors often remembered details about jobs, noticed things that needed attention. So when he suggested they go downstairs to look at something, Marty led the way. She was 2 steps from the bottom when everything changed. Without warning, without explanation, Brian grabbed her throat with a grip so tight and strong that her voice began to fade. She kept asking what he was doing, but he remained silent. The man who had made pleasant conversation during his work visits now showed no emotion, offered no explanation for the violence he was inflicting. As her voice grew weaker and softer, Marty realized she couldn't speak at all. Then darkness took over, and she lost consciousness. What happened next would be reconstructed by forensic evidence and medical testimony, painting a picture of violence so extreme it defied comprehension. The investigation revealed that after strangling Marty into unconsciousness, Brian didn't stop there. Evidence suggested he then beat her head repeatedly against the concrete basement floor, causing multiple facial fractures and severe brain trauma. The sustained nature of the attack spoke to a level of rage that seemed completely disconnected from any rational motive. But even that wasn't enough. In what prosecutors would later describe as an act of pure evil, Brian then took out a knife and slashed Marty's throat 3 to 4 times, leaving her to die alone in her basement. The cuts were so deep they severed major blood vessels and came within millimeters of completely cutting through her main artery. The crime scene told a story of unimaginable brutality. Blood covered the basement floor from corner to corner. The violence had been so extensive, so sustained, that investigators who had worked hundreds of cases said they'd never seen anything quite like it. This wasn't the work of someone who had lost control in a moment of anger. This was methodical, deliberate, and designed to ensure the victim would not survive. But Brian Pennington had made one critical miscalculation. He believed Marty was dead when he left her basement that morning. He had no way of knowing that this small, seemingly fragile woman possessed a strength that would defy every medical expectation. When investigators arrived at his door that evening, Brian appeared genuinely surprised to learn that Marty was still alive. His cooperation during the initial interview now made perfect sense. If he believed his victim was dead, then there would be no witness to identify him. The scratches on his face could be explained away. The blood on his jeans could be dismissed as something else entirely. He likely thought the investigation would focus elsewhere, perhaps on a stranger or someone with an obvious motive. The DNA evidence changed everything. When the lab confirmed that the blood on Brian's jeans belonged to Marty Hill, investigators knew they had their man, but they still needed to understand the scope of who they were dealing with. Further investigation into Brian's background revealed a pattern of violence that painted a chilling picture of escalation. Records showed Brian had over 60 contacts with law enforcement officers throughout his young life. He had been involved in multiple domestic violence incidents that resulted in injuries to victims. 2 wives, 2 girlfriends, all had experienced his capacity for brutality. For Brian Pennington, beating women wasn't something new or unprecedented. It was a pattern of behavior that had been building towards something catastrophic. The revelation about Brian's history of domestic violence cast his wife Jessica's initial alibi in a different light. When detectives first interviewed her, she had seemed nervous, young, naive. She insisted her husband had been home with her during the entire time frame of the attack. But investigators suspected she was lying to protect him, possibly out of fear of what he might do to her if she told the truth. Jessica was only 20 years old with 2 young children. She had experienced Brian's violence firsthand and knew what he was capable of when crossed. Her initial lie wasn't born of loyalty, but of terror. She understood that cooperating with police could put her own life in danger. When investigators approached Jessica separately, away from her husband's presence, they were able to get her to open up about the truth. They explained to her how severely beaten Marty had been, how close she had come to dying, and how important it was for justice to be served. The human side of Jessica responded to this appeal. In a breakthrough moment for the case, Jessica broke down and admitted she had lied. Brian had not been home with her during the time of the attack. In fact, she revealed that her husband had a history of assaulting and threatening her as well. Her false alibi had been given out of fear, but learning about the extent of Marty's injuries helped her find the courage to tell the truth. Jessica's admission transformed her from a hostile witness protecting her abuser into one of the prosecution's most important allies. Her testimony would prove crucial in establishing that Brian had no alibi for the morning of the attack, and that his pattern of violence against women extended far beyond what happened to Marty. As the case against Brian Pennington solidified, investigators felt confident they could secure a conviction. The DNA evidence was ironclad. Marty's identification was clear and unwavering. Jessica's recanted testimony eliminated Brian's alibi. The scratches on his face corroborated a physical struggle. Everything pointed to one inescapable conclusion, but the question that haunted everyone involved in the case remained unanswered. Why had Brian Pennington decided to brutally attack a woman who had hired him, paid him fairly, and treated him with respect? There had been no theft from Marty's home. Money and valuables were left untouched. There was no evidence of sexual assault, no history of conflict or disagreement between them. The randomness of the violence was perhaps its most terrifying aspect. If Brian could attack Marty without any apparent motive, then no one who had ever hired him or interacted with him was truly safe. The realization sent shockwaves through the community and raised uncomfortable questions about how well we really know the people we invite into our homes and lives. For Marty's family, the arrest brought a mixture of relief and continued anguish. Relief that the monster who had nearly killed their loved one was behind bars. Anguish over the senseless nature of the crime and the long road to recovery that still lay ahead. The physical healing was only the beginning. The emotional and psychological trauma would take much longer to address. Marty herself faced the daunting prospect of rebuilding her life from the ground up. The brain injury had affected her balance, her vision, her hearing, her memory, and her ability to process information normally. Simple tasks that had once been automatic now required conscious effort and concentration. The strong, capable woman who had been known for her reliability and competence now struggled with basic functions, yet even as she fought to regain her physical abilities, Marty demonstrated the same determination that had kept her alive through the attack. With the support of her family and medical team, she began the slow process of recovery, knowing that her survival and her willingness to testify would be crucial to ensuring Brian Pennington faced justice for his crimes. The legal proceedings that followed would test everyone involved in ways they never imagined. Brian Pennington was charged with attempted first-degree murder, and the prosecution was determined to see him serve the maximum sentence allowed under law. The evidence seemed overwhelming, but in the American justice system, even the most clear-cut cases can take unexpected turns. As preparations for trial began, the prosecution team faced a critical decision about how to present their case. The DNA evidence on Pennington's genes was powerful, but they knew defense attorneys would try to create reasonable doubt wherever possible. The lack of a clear motive remained problematic, giving the defense room to argue that perhaps someone else had committed the crime. Marty's recovery continued slowly but steadily. The woman who had once been known for her sharp mind and quick wit now struggled with basic cognitive functions. Her speech was sometimes unclear, her memory had gaps, and her physical coordination remained impaired. The prosecution worried whether she would be strong enough to testify, and whether a jury would find her testimony credible given her brain injury. But Marty possessed something that no amount of physical trauma could destroy: an unshakable determination to see justice done. She worked tirelessly with speech therapists and physical rehabilitation specialists, driven by the knowledge that her testimony could be the key to putting her attacker behind bars. Her children watched in amazement as their mother fought to reclaim pieces of herself that had been stolen in those terrible minutes in her basement. The preliminary hearing arrived with tremendous anticipation and anxiety. This would be the first time Marty would face her attacker in a courtroom setting, and no one knew how she would react. The stakes couldn't have been higher. If the prosecution failed to convince the judge there was sufficient evidence to proceed to trial, Pennington would walk free. When Pennington was brought into the courtroom, the contrast was stark. He sat alone on his side of the room, with no family members present to support him. Not even his mother had come. He stared straight ahead, showing no emotion, until Marty entered the courtroom. Only then did his head turn, his eyes following her slow, deliberate walk to the witness stand. Those who witnessed that moment described it as chilling. Pennington's expression seemed to convey disbelief that his victim was not only alive, but walking into court to testify against him. The ghost he thought he had created was very much real and very much determined to see him pay for what he had done. Marty's testimony was powerful in its simplicity. Despite her injuries and the trauma she had endured, her identification of Pennington was clear and unwavering. She looked directly at him as she spoke, showing a courage that inspired everyone in the courtroom. Her voice may have been weaker than before, but her words carried the weight of absolute truth. The prosecution's case was further strengthened when Jessica Pennington took the stand. Her decision to tell the truth about her husband's whereabouts that morning was crucial, but it came at great personal cost. She knew that by testifying against him, she was putting herself and her children at risk of retaliation. Yet she found the strength to do what was right. The judge ruled that there was sufficient evidence to proceed to trial. But as the case moved forward, unexpected developments began to emerge. Pennington's defense team, recognizing the strength of the evidence against their client, began exploring the possibility of a plea agreement. The prospect of facing a jury with DNA evidence, victim identification, and witness testimony seemed daunting even to experienced defense attorneys. Negotiations between the prosecution and defense stretched on for months. The central question was how much time Pennington would serve in prison. The prosecution wanted to ensure he would be locked away for as long as legally possible, while the defense sought to minimize his sentence. For Marty and her family, the uncertainty was agonizing. Eventually, both sides reached an agreement. Pennington would plead guilty to the charges against him in exchange for a sentence of 28.5 years in prison. For the prosecution, it guaranteed a significant prison term without the uncertainty of a jury trial. For Marty, it meant she wouldn't have to endure the grueling process of a full trial and could begin to find some closure. But even this resolution would not come without drama. On the day of sentencing, as family members prepared to deliver victim impact statements, Pennington shocked everyone by attempting to withdraw his guilty plea. After weeks of accepting responsibility for his actions, he suddenly claimed the pressure was too much and the sentence too long. The judge was having none of it. Pennington's reasons for wanting to withdraw his plea were deemed insufficient, and the sentencing proceeded as planned. One by one, Marty's family members stood before the court to tell Pennington exactly how his actions had affected their lives. Her teenage daughter's statement was particularly powerful. She looked directly at Pennington as she spoke about the trauma of seeing her mother in the hospital, about the fear that had consumed their family, about the strength they had found in each other. Even though Pennington refused to look at her, she knew he was hearing every word. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Marty herself stood before the man who had tried to kill her. Her voice was steady as she spoke about his betrayal of her trust, about the pain he had caused not just to her, but to everyone who loved her. She asked him the question that had haunted her since that terrible morning. "Why did you do this to me?" Pennington's response was silence. Even given the opportunity to explain his actions, to show some remorse, to offer some understanding of what had driven him to such violence, he chose to say nothing. That silence spoke volumes about the kind of person he truly was. The judge sentenced Brian Pennington to 28.5 years in the Kansas state prison system. He would have to serve at least a significant portion of that sentence before becoming eligible for parole. For a man who had lived only 26 years, the prospect of spending more time behind bars than he had spent as a free man was sobering. Today, Marty Hill continues her recovery, forever changed, but never broken by what happened to her. The scars on her neck serve as a constant reminder of how close she came to death, but they also represent her incredible survival. She has returned to kickboxing, pushing herself physically as part of her ongoing rehabilitation. The woman who once weighed 97 pounds and was known as dynamite in a small package has proven that some forces of nature cannot be extinguished. Her story serves as a chilling reminder that evil can wear a familiar face, that danger can come from the most unexpected sources. Brian Pennington wasn't a stranger lurking in shadows. He was someone Marty knew, someone she had trusted, someone she had welcomed into her home. That betrayal of trust makes his crime even more heinous, and her survival even more remarkable. The question of motive may never be fully answered. Pennington's silence has left his victim and her family without the closure that understanding might bring. But perhaps that's fitting. Some acts of violence are so senseless, so devoid of rational explanation, that trying to understand them is futile. What matters is that justice was served, that a dangerous predator was removed from society, and that a remarkable woman found the strength to survive and rebuild her life. In the end, this case reminds us all to be vigilant, to trust our instincts, and to remember that sometimes the greatest threats come from those we least suspect. The stranger you know may be the most dangerous stranger of all.